Gender and Race, Women, Contraception, and the Affordable Care Act. So basically, choosing gender and race, history of gender and race, a current issue that's formed in the last, um, the last couple years through the Obama administration to the Trump administration is the interpretation on contraceptives and whether they should be free. And through the Affordable Care Act, they are in fact free, and people don't have to pay out of pocket. But recently, Trump has issued executive orders making it harder and harder for contraceptives to be, in fact, free and not out of pocket. This is also an issue that has been brought to people's attentions based off of certain statistics having to do with the contraceptives that are being used freely, and people taking advantage of the Affordable Care Act in that regard. And then there's also a movement of conservatives who are in the other camp, who in fact are trying to make it harder and harder for people to get contraceptives free, as well as the ultimate end goal to overturn Roe versus Wade. So I'm going to be talking about that, looking at a couple sources towards the end. But in the beginning here, I think it's important to build context of the women's movement throughout U.S. history to the Affordable Care Act and the women and contraceptives. So, origins in colonial society. When focusing specifically on roles of gender in the U.S., gravitation can pull the historian directly to the colonial period and the role of women in comparison to that of men. White men have always had the privilege of being looked upon as citizens in the United States. In this case, a citizen would be someone who is male, white, and owns land. So women, of course, are not, in fact, considered citizens during this time. But that's not to say they don't have a role in society. The market revolution and how it affected women. So in the early 1800s, the beginning of the market revolutions, single women basically started to take different part in society, especially in industrialized cities like New York and Philadelphia. Mills and factories were common places for them to work. If they were to marry, then they would quit their jobs, mostly quit their jobs and move in to stay home or to stay at home with their families and take care as well as raise the kids. Furthermore, both in urban and rural areas, they were gaining more control of their lives by having less children and arranging their own marriages instead of their parents doing it for them. Origins, westward expansion, and the pioneer woman. So westward expansion, the pioneer woman takes a larger role of being second in command of their husband, taking on, more responsibilities. Some of these responsibilities were completing daily medical tasks for people who are hurt, helping, keep people, well taken care of, especially the children, taking baths in this image here, making food, of course. The tough task of childbearing were often on the prairies, and in the West, women would not live past some of their bearing processes or them having kids, which would result into death. So we can kind of see up to this point that women have played an important role in society, especially in family and care. But civil and political activism isn't really taking place yet. It's not really until close to the temperance movement and also abolitionists that women start to be accepted as taking roles into the civil activist sphere. And one of these that comes to mind is Harry Beecher Stowe. She's one of the greatest activists in the 18th century. She wrote the book Uncle Tom's Cabin, which shed light on how slaves were treated in the South, as well how they were looked upon, or she painted this light of them being equal to humans in their mannerisms and how they act. The early Uncle Tom is portrayed as somebody who's heroic and somebody who's moral and cares about others, including his white friends and slaves and counterparts, and also sacrifices his life instead of ratting out his friends. One thing that Lincoln said when hearing about her and the abolitionist movement and what she did to contribute towards it, quote unquote, he says, "You're the little woman who started this great war," when he met her. Of course, this is not necessarily the case, but she definitely contributed towards it. One thing she often said was, "It's a matter of taking the side of the weak against the strong, something the best people have always done." So she's looked by many women as a pioneer within the political sphere and having a voice for women. Temperance movement is another vehicle of which women took advantage of having a role in civil activism. Women like Carrie Ann Nation, who's here in Hatchetation, of actually, going into bars during the temperance movement and trying to bring about prohibition and trying, to give people the gospel or the Holy Bible. And if they weren't willing to accept it and continue to drink, she would throw hatchets at them. She stood, 6 foot tall. People were often intimidated by her. Often women would, show up in pictures, lips that, and have this slogan, "Lips that touch liquor shall not touch ours." So this is definitely a sphere that was widely accepted by most, or the media accepting it because religion or Protestantism was at the forefront, which is a huge movement during the Second Great Awakening and through the late 1800s, westward expansion, Manifest Destiny, all that stuff. Religion is very much intertwined during this time period. Okay, the 19th. So temperance during the 19th movement, temperance kind of helped, and as well as women becoming educated in colleges, which was becoming more common, helped women to play even a stronger role in political activism, and fighting for the 19th Amendment, which was passed in 1920 for women to gain their right to vote. And from this movement, one thing that came about was Margaret Sanger and her ability to advocate birth control and actually educate people on birth control, trying to manage the use of childbearing, and during this movement of people often having too many children, not being able to take care of them. It focused on the working class, and this is a huge turn towards the current debate and the current issue of contraceptives and birth control today. This took place over 100 years ago in the early 1900s. And it still continues to be a issue. In the 1970s, the Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA, in which women made much progress in getting equality in the workplace. Birth control also came up because it was a direct effect to the 1960s and the sexual revolution, and people having kids then as well. So getting to today, the Affordable Care Act and contraceptives under the Obama administration. So the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare, was passed by Congress in the Obama administration in 2010. This act overall actually did the opposite of what it was intended for by raising health care costs instead of lowering them. It can be arguably the most successful act under the Obama administration due to this fact, although with the act came contraceptives being at no cost to women. In the charts and graphs, this can be seen as to how many women were in favor of this by taking advantage of the birth control pills and other contraceptives that kept them from being pregnant. But these are, small polls compared to the vast majority of Americans taking hold of it. And in other words, there's not just 11.2 or around that many people in the United States. There's huge amounts, as you can gather, of people actually participating or not participating in taking advantage of contraceptives in the Affordable Care Act. One group that is against some contraceptives is the religious right, and people in the conservative party who are against aborting babies and abortion and pro-life, who are very active in trying to override Roe versus Wade. So contraceptives and the Trump administration in 2017, under Trump's executive order of free speech and religious liberty, allowed the framework for other federal politicians as well as state governments to allow conscientious objectives to Planned Parenthood clinics as well as birth control, no longer being covered by American health care plans, forcing them to pay out of pocket. And this event is a direct response to the conservative resurgence of the 1980s and the Reagan administration, the Bush administrations, and that camp of people who are pro-life. So Trump just basically making it more difficult, especially for smaller governments and clinics and healthcare systems, state to state, of being able to implement contraceptives or even abortion to people without giving them literature or things like that beforehand on what they're actually doing. My main source to look upon, it's more of a left source, is shows different data and stuff like that on how people are actually using contraceptives. This source is trustworthy source because it gives specifics as to how the data was collected as far as who's taking advantage of the contraceptive care, including under the Affordable Care Act. National Survey of Family Growth, or the NSFG, is a data collecting service of different surveys in which women 15 to 44 were taking, and men 15 to 44 took this survey from 2011 to 2015. It was interviews were taken actually in September from 2011 to 2015 with 20,620 men who took the survey, and also including 4,134 teenagers, 2,047 females, 2,087 males, and the response rate was 72.5% for male teens and 73.0% for female teens. Now, of course, this isn't the vast majority of Americans, but it's still good data to show how many people were actually taking advantage of the Affordable Care Act. So that was my left source, and this is my right. This source is a trustworthy source due to the fact that it is a case study done at a university displaying specific events that have taken place, providing the actions that the anti-abortion camp has been taking in order to try and overrun or overturn Roe v. Wade. The data comes from the Allen Gutenberg Institute, as well as other institutions that help display the different actions taking place. And he kind of lists the different ways, and here's only a few of them, of how people across the country are actively taking roles and trying to overrun or replace Roe versus Wade. One is, a simple license plate that says "Choose Life," that introduced in Rhode Island. Number 6 here, insurance coverage of abortion laws concerning abortion coverage and health plans offered through health exchanges, introduced in 17 states and enacted in Arkansas, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Virginia, passed one chamber in Minnesota. So he's kind of listing out through this, and it's a ton of pages of different ways across the country that people are actually actively trying to overturn Roe versus Wade. This source is limited, though, as to how many people got behind it, as opposed to the other source. Statistically, it's not giving as much qualitative data, but it still is listing the different things that are happening. In conclusion, female equality over time has been an uphill battle over time. The contraception issue in healthcare has been the current issue that has been able to make a connection across all of the sub-movements mentioned, including Sanger's abortion movement over 100 years ago. The two sources mentioned that provide the contraception movement to be an event that connects to this movement is pretty evident on both liberal and conservative fronts. Both do have gaps, being that both are biased in their motives. Nonetheless, though, both prove that much labor is being enacted today, both at the state and national level, to fight for either pro-life or pro-choice in the midst of healthcare reform in this country. Here is my references, which are listed on every slide that I used. And that's it.